Tonight is our fourth in a series of programs called the League of Women Voters Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with DATV to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodary. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host for this evening as we discuss tonight's topic, navigating our political differences. Our guests this evening are elected official from Dayton to the General House of Assembly in both the House and the Senate at various times, and current president of the Ohio Conference of the NAACP, Tom Roberts. And also Charles Curran, both a city commissioner for Dayton in the 70s and then as the Ohio State Senator for the 6th District, and also now he served also as Montgomery County City Commissioner, but most recently he has filled an open position on the Beaver Creek City Council. So thank you both for being here. You know, we find ourselves living in a really politically contentious climate. And I don't recall a time in my own life when things felt so difficult. It seems that that both Republicans and Democrats are unable to reach across the aisle in order to find compromise at times. And so what I wanted to do is really talk about ways that maybe in your careers you were able to reach across the aisle to accomplish some compromise, and then we'll kind of dig into more about why the divisiveness and what can we do about it. That's kind of where we're hoping to go, and I'm inviting you to share any thoughts you've got first on the divisiveness, but then also maybe some things that you did in your careers as elected officials to try to reach across the aisle.
Chuck, why don't you go first?
Well, I was thinking of some legislation. I can recall back when tax abatement was being proposed by our city manager at the time, Jim Kunde, as a way to try to bring Mead Corporation downtown. Very controversial. And I can recall meetings with the legislators, both Democrat and Republican from the district, coming together and seeing a common purpose, which was to revitalize downtown Dayton.
Sure.
And crossing those barriers one by one to try to bring about a bill that would allow this to happen. And you know, at the time, I probably didn't think much of it, but it was a good example of working arm in arm for the betterment of downtown.
Right, and finding that common goal that you could share despite perhaps the differences in how one might wish to get there.
Correct.
But yeah, good. Tom, how about you?
For me, David, I saw a shift in the early 90s because I think pretty much so, as Charles pointed out, I grew up in the 60s, graduated in the 70s, so that was my academic period. So I really got involved in the political arena early 70s, you know, as working on various campaigns, then getting involved in the clerk's office and as a bailiff. But I saw the same thing that Charles saw, working together, you know, common unity among the members in this community, probably statewide as well. Because I remember going to Columbus a couple of times with C.J. McLean and others, and I saw, you know, the working together across party lines. For me, I think it kind of broke down in the early 90s. And I want to say 90 to 94 is when I actually, because I was there, when I actually observed a transition from going across, working, to actually partisan approach to what was going on. You know, when we were in the General Assembly, we went to something called the National Conference of State Legislators.
Okay.
And then there was the Council for State Government, which was a combination of judiciary and legislative. But in the same time, there was a new group on the scene called American Legislative Exchange Commission, ALEC.
Okay.
And many of my colleagues from across the aisle stopped coming to the National Conference of State Legislators and start going to ALEC. And ALEC is more of a business organization with legislators. And so that's where because we also would have annual get-togethers. The Chamber of Commerce would put together a forum at Salt Lake Park.
That's
Okay.
right.
And we would all go to it.
Right.
You know, and our families would come with us to National Conference State Legislatures.
Right.
And so it was kind of a friendly atmosphere. You could debate and argue all you wanted in the State House.
Right.
But you go to dinner across the street.
Right.
and
With
have
your
fun.
families?
No, I'm sorry. I'm mixing two conversations.
Oh, okay.
With legislators.
I gotcha.
The families would come with us to the state conventions.
To the convention.
To the conventions, and we would, as legislators, go to Salt Fork, bonding together.
Right.
But so their point I was making is we would debate all we wanted. We stood our ground in the State House, in committee, where we go across the street and have dinner, you know, and work in committees, in dinner meetings.
Tom, you were there under which governor first?
Celeste. Governor
Celeste first.
Celeste. I can probably remember more speakers because it was right for the longest time, and longest time, and then Speaker. Just thought of her name the other day. The first female Speaker of the House.
I'm not.
Joanne Davidson.
Joanne Davidson.
Davidson. So it would have been Dick Celeste, followed by Gavonovich, followed by Taft, and Strickland.
Right.
Yeah, and I did serve on the KC.
And so then, Chuck, you were there.
I was there during the administration of James Rhodes.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, and that was very interesting to see how the governor and the speaker and the minority leader really informally would talk. And of course, people may look at that with disdain today, but there was a lot more socialization.
Yeah.
I was on the education committee, and we would have some very intense hearings.
Sure.
But we'd go to supper with each other across at the Neal House, which today is the legislative offices of the state house. But there was always that rapport. Yeah, you would have some heated exchanges, but after that was done, you were friends. You know, kind of a different world.
So you both know that my wife worked with Governor Taft during his second term, and I've had a chance to meet with him a number of times, and he shared a similar story to what I just heard, in that you would go over to the park, you might bring family to a picnic-style event that included both the R's and the D's, and you know, all the children would be interacting, and so there was a little different opportunity perhaps to see one another in a different light, and certainly that would be welcome again.
I think that's very important.
I think it is.
And I think it's being missed today. I know tensions are high in some respects, and issues get very intense, but boy, when you can't speak to each other, that's kind of touchy.
So let's talk for a minute about what maybe some of the influences on that divisiveness might have been in the last 15, or I don't know if it's been 20 years, but 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. What might have adversely impacted our officials' ability to be willing to talk across the aisle or compromise? Can you think of things that you've seen that have changed?
Well, for me, David, it goes back to a book we read on campus, The Big Sort. And we all lived in the same communities. We worked very close together. But then migration to the suburbs brought about a shift, and no longer had to sit next to you, work with you. And so I had my own mindset. And then my community supported that. And so for me, I think there's been a great shift where we did look out for each other. And I think in the last 15 to 20 years, and I think reports, the Pew Foundation and others kind of support that we have a mind shift away from those big issues such as immigration, such as education, equal opportunity. So I think, to me, I think we've moved away from people, and we've created a divide, as the author calls it, a big sort.
Right. Other things that you think of?
I see term limits, and again, you can't single it out. I realize there's legislative districts, but term limits drives an individual to be one issue oriented, and you've got to get it done quick. And with a lot of legislators today, you've got to get out there before 8 years, get out, do something else.
Right.
I think that drives a lot of the dynamics. When I was in there wasn't any term limits. I was sitting with guys, which some of the public viewing would probably see today with disdain, but they had been in there 20 years. They knew more than the lobbyists. More importantly, they knew each other.
Right. They had relationship with one another.
And you don't have time today.
And they had a long-term relationship such that if I give something to you today, I might be able to ask for something back in the future.
Correct.
Whereas now it's got to be done, right?
Right.
It's gotta be
It
done
was the
now.
art of compromise. As I grew up with Lyndon Baines Johnson, the teacher in art of compromise, and I guess that's kind of lost today. It's with John McCain passing away. Authors after authors have said he is the last of a breed of members of Congress who knew the art of compromise. And so today, I think both in Columbus and in Washington, it's what Charles is talking about, that I don't have to work with you. And I think the other piece of that would be the whole issue of redistricting, where I really don't have to work with you now, because my challenge is in the primary.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is the idea of the districts being somewhat gerrymandered, or maybe not even somewhat, but dramatically gerrymandered in some areas, such that you're secure in your position, and so long as you continue to sort of satisfy the farthest edge, then you're going to be okay. That'll change, right? I mean, I think we're recognizing that
we'll
some
see
of this
that,
will be.
with the census and the next election coming up. Well, you'll see district boundaries being modified, and of course, the League of Women Voters have
Right.
worked out up front on that very, very diligently. They see that it happens.
Yeah,
Yeah, and to that point, the League, NAACP, Common Cause, and other groups, probably about 4 years ago, worked with the legislature to pass.
Right.
After the citizens passed initiative
A
dealing with
referendum,
reapportionment, which is the state legislators, then groups like us working with the League and others put together the redistricting plan, and that should call for much fairer districts being drawn. Now the challenge is that we have to make sure the legislature sticks to what we wrote in that legislation.
right. And I recognize that there's nothing that's going to be absolutely perfect the first time, and that it might take some efforts and probably some revisiting to try to continue to encourage it in the right direction. Other things, you talk about districts, you talk about term limits, other things that you think of that maybe influence our elected officials. And really we can think back to the citizens to be so willing to take sort of strong positions in opposition to one another. Other thoughts?
Yeah. I was thinking of a point which I think Tom referred to kind of directly here and indirectly, and that's simply the growing influence of the way that we think about each other, which Tom touched on some of these. Let me a few. One, favoring binary thinking. Either you are or you're not, but you're not one of us. Number two, absolutism and values. Thirdly, anybody who shows uncertainty is a weak individual, and we don't want that person in office. And assuming your opponent is motivated by bad faith.
Assuming, is this
Yes.
what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah.
Assuming that they're motivated
Yeah,
by
I mean, just a
as
few.
opposed to assuming that they might have some idea that is beneficial to others.
That's correct. But that really kind of scares me more than anything else, is the way that we begin to think about each other. Yeah, I know there's a variety of things that you could call items out there that maybe reinforce that, but I see that,
Right.
and so do you.
I do, and I think that goes back to that knowing each other, knowing their families, knowing where
Right.
they come from.
Very much.
That's missing. That is terribly missing at I think both in the State House and in Congress. That's why I'm thankful that at least locally,
Yeah.
I see people working together. I see the city councils working together. In fact, I think that's where we're going to learn how to run government from city councils. Local government's going to be the biggest model for us to look at in the future.
Yeah. I think about technology, and one of the first places I begin, as you talked about the suburbs being developed, and of course one of the things that happened is people had garages either added or part of their home, and as soon as you get a garage, you get a garage door opener. Right. And the technology of that garage door opener opening up and then closing, you didn't even have to actually get out of your car in front of your neighbors, because it opens and closes and you're in your house. And while that's simplistic and probably not entirely going to influence whether or not I interact with my neighbor or not, I do think technology has created a bit of a divide. And so then I read David Brooks' articles often, and I find, even though I don't always agree with him politically, I find he has some really great insights. He talks a lot about the echo chambers that we find ourselves in, and the way in which the various apps or tools, social media tools that we use, sort of just reiterate to us the same things that we want to hear.
Right.
And so, of course, I work pretty hard to make sure I'm getting my information from a variety of sources. And I certainly think that that's important to all of us as well.
I think you're right, the echo chamber, and there's another word I was trying to think of, but with the technology, people with Facebook and all of the apps people have, they no longer have to talk.
Right.
You know, they can throw a bomb and run away.
Yeah.
You know, in the words. I mean,
Is that other word the bubble?
Yeah.
Is that the bubble
no,
that you were thinking of?
but you're close to us in the communication world. You know, but it basically says that I don't have to have a conversation. I can just put it out there and boom. You know, it's out there.
Well, and we have so many choices. We can choose just the things we like. We don't have to. Whereas at one time, and even I remember, you know, you could watch Walter Cronkite and you would get a variety of pieces of the world. You wouldn't just get your view of the world. And I think now I could choose a news station that agrees with my political perspective or what I might prefer the world look like. And that isn't necessarily a healthy approach because, of course, we all live in this world, not just people that watch one station or another.
Correct. Yeah, we have kind of a media ghetto.
Yeah.
Better Angels calls it that, where,
that's
as you've already
interesting.
mentioned, where you can select out sites,
Yeah.
has already been mentioned, and live your whole life like that.
Right. And I think there's parts of the technology that we're not even aware of that are influencing us. The mathematical logarithms that determine what shows up on my feed that can influence it. And I know, Charles, you're probably not as in tune to some of the apps that our students are.
Probably not.
But certainly, as citizens, we're seeing that the future citizens, right, are really influenced by those sorts of tools. So it's interesting. So as it relates to this divide, are there things that we can do about it that you think about and think, oh, we ought to do this, try that? Other things we should attempt?
Well, I think to be candid and honest about what it's doing to our democracy is one piece, and then to go back to some basic concepts of having civil discourse, civil conversation around tough issues, you know, and not putting our heads in the sand or going to the point that Charles was making, which I think is a very interesting one, that because I don't trust you, I don't trust what you're saying, you know, and you're not saying what I like to hear, so I don't trust anything you say.
And in some ways, I don't trust what you're saying, and now I don't like you.
And I don't like you.
And that's not the same rationale or reasoning, and yet it seems to be what happens.
What's happening.
Yeah.
Audiences. Tom and I and other individuals who've served in public office knows many times when you'd go to a meeting, the audience is set up. There's somebody out there who's gonna stir it up. They're there deliberately to aggravate the crowd. And wouldn't it be great, you know, if both sides would say, look, you know, we're gonna have a fair conversation. That may be idealistic on my part, but where you can have an effort on both parts to quiet that type of individual from taking over the meeting.
Right.
By having some of your own there to say, sit down. We're going to talk about, we're going to have a civil conversation, Joe, and you're not going to dominate.
Yeah.
That would be incredible.
I think in some ways, and it's not only politicians, but it's all kinds of people in the world have gotten so good at staging events, right? Yes. And so even from a public relations perspective, sometimes I get frustrated because it looks organic, and yet you have enough insight to realize that it's not at all the organic that it could or should be. How do we reverse the trend?
Wow.
I mean, I think about it as a teacher. I think we have to educate our students to become critical consumers of the apps, of the news that they get.
Well, You know, one way you reverse the trend is making sure that individuals are subject to different opinions, that they are exposed to. I can remember on campus a situation where the students actually walked out. Yeah, from a speaker.
Oh.
And I think that was bad manners. Now, I know the tensions were high. I won't use any names. But I think that's wrong philosophically. I think they should have been mannerly, sat there, asked questions, but not to turn their backs and walk out. That sets the stage for what we're talking about tonight.
Right.
We don't want to feed that kind of stuff.
That's an interesting perspective. I remember that event. I didn't think of it in that way at the time, but I appreciate your perspective.
I think people need to be called out on that. Say, look, we're trying to develop young citizens for the future who are going to listen to each other, and by you leading the walkout, what are you doing to these kids? You're saying it's right, and I think that's wrong.
Yeah, interesting. Any other thoughts, Tom?
Not on that, no.
So one of the things that I just thought of is that we're really lucky in Dayton in that we have a resource that's available to the whole nation, but it's located right here through the Kettering Foundation.
Yes, absolutely.
And the National Issue Forum
Right.
discussions are such a great way to expose ourselves and one another to a variety of different perspectives. And what I love about what the folks over at the Kettering Foundation do is they provide those National Issue Forum guides that really are not just one or another perspective, but oftentimes intermingled 3 or sometimes 4 different perspectives on an issue, whether that issue be homelessness, hunger,
Right.
Opioid addiction, whatever the things are. And so I'm always encouraging people to look up that Kettering Foundation website, find those resources, and try to use them, certainly in classrooms, but we can use them also in the community. We've done some of those events at local libraries and things like that.
And also, I was on a panel with the Curran Foundation many years ago with several legislators, Merle Curran being one,
Right.
and a colleague of ours from Hawaii, and the conversations, how we can use the deliberative dialogue in the legislative process. And I think one of the cities in the South, either Georgia or South Carolina, uses that at the beginning of the year. In other words, instead of coming to you and saying, what is your position on House Bill whatever House Bill whatever is, put that issue out there and have people dialogue on it, and the legislators were sitting on the fringes
And
listening
listen.
to as citizens were developing their
That's a good
thoughts
idea.
on the pieces of legislation, and so of the proposal. So that is another way that the Kettering Foundation has used the deliberative dialogue to get its point across, and it works. It works. It works.
And I'm sure that both of you have found the importance of listening just critical to your success as elected officials.
Right.
I think oftentimes we're not rewarded for our listening ability, right? Because what people see is the talker, but what they don't see is the time it took to listen to understand an issue
a good
before the
point.
talker began, right? So I guess the old maxim that we have 2 ears and one mouth and ought to listen twice as much as we talk. Yeah.
I think the other thing, David, that is impacting today and is the influx of the parties, and the division in both parties, split division, and I think I don't even know if we're seeing a change in the guard. We're just seeing change of ideology inside of the parties,
Big time.
big time. And I think the election of President, the current president, kind of shares the division in the Republican Party. The Democrats have always had these kind of divisions going on.
I'm glad you admit that.
Yeah. There was an old joke said, "I don't belong to any political party. I'm a Democrat." But I think the division in the parties, and we see it on the Democratic debates, of where that division is at. And I think so. I guess what I'm saying is that we look to the parties as stabilizing factors in what we're doing, even though historically we knew that Teddy Roosevelt had his own group after he was kicked, after he decided not to run again. So we've had it, but today the influx of the political parties today is really dramatic as relates to what's going on.
Yeah. Charles, I know you teach
Yeah,
civics and
Democrats labeled liberals and Republicans conservatives, and where's the moderates? Where's the middle? It's the middle ground. Well, if you are in the middle ground, then you're probably suspect in either party.
and it's so hard for me to, but I don't disagree. It's so hard for me to live in this era, in part because I think I've always found myself much more aligned with the middle, and not necessarily one party or the other,
Right.
but
Right.
that I found myself much more
Well,
in the middle.
I think the voters are still that way. I always say it's a third, but it's like 35% independent, 30% Democrat, and 20-some% Republican.
About,
So it's
yeah.
still third, basically. But a huge number of people still consider themselves independent,
Yeah.
as belonging to neither political party.
And it's probably good to remember that the parties that we have today weren't always the parties that were in
That's right,
the
yeah.
Union.
Very much so.
So that these things can and do change over time. And so perhaps there's parts of that are affecting
Yeah.
us as well.
A friend of mine, we weekly or bi-weekly have this conversation of how African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party and what brought that on.
Sure.
And I think it may be Roosevelt, may be Truman, but the whole way that it developed and brought about in the South being segregated. And that was the Democrats. And so for us, the whole conversation of how we evolved into our political affiliation is interesting as well.
Well, and I would argue, and are evolving, right? It's
Yeah.
not just that we're static and stayed, but we're actually changing even now.
I see another shift too, which really kind of is, everything is more super donors, wealthier donors are looking at ideologies versus the party candidates.
Right.
Who are we going to back? It's got to be an individual issue, and I think that really is something that has an impact.
Right. Well, we've
driver.
only got a couple minutes left. One of the ideas that I try hard to communicate to students that I encounter, and actually to anybody I try to demonstrate it, comes right out of the work by Jack Gibb, who was a scholar, a communication scholar, who looked at supportive and defensive climates and the way in which our behavior can influence whether our environment or our climate is supportive or defensive. One of the things that I've learned from his work is the idea of provisionalism. And I know both of you are good at using provisionalized statements that say, well, it may not always be true, or you may disagree with me, but this is the way I see it, right? We provisionalize and say, well, to me, I see it this way, right? Or, you know, when I was in office, this is the way it was. That's putting a limit on or provisionalizing. And so not using more certain kinds of dogmatic terms that might say, any idiot would know that, right? Because when we are dogmatic, it leaves no room for another person's perspective. And so sometimes it's as simple as our language choices that we can make.
Well, and going back to Senator McCain, when the point came up about Obama, and I forget if it was his citizenship or something, he just stopped. No. He just stopped the crowd right there and said, that's not the case, you know? And that has to happen. You have to sometimes, you know, help people understand what you're saying is not true.
Right. Well, our time is just about up. Any other thoughts, Charles, as you reflect
No, I
on
would
things?
hope that the listening audience tonight would hear us tonight and maybe give us some good input as to additional
Absolutely.
suggestions for more civil discourse in our political arena in the years to come.
Absolutely. So we want to thank our guests, past Senator and Representative Tom Roberts, current Beaver Creek City Commissioner, past Senator Charles Curran, for a lively discussion on political division and civility. I want to thank all of you and our viewing audience for watching the League of Women Voter Empowering You program. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to be a voter by being registered to vote and then actively voting in every election. If you have any further questions about how to register to vote, or how to participate and give suggestions for upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing LWVDayton.org. So that's league@LWVDayton.org, or calling our office at 937-228-4041. That's 937-228-4041. Have a great evening and good night.